Hey guys, we have reached recordings for day 3, and we are talking about fidelity today. Not like fidelity and infidelity in relationships, but fidelity in relation to experimental procedures. So you can sort of think of this as having sort of 3 different components that we could think about. Most commonly, we think about it as what's the percentage of adherence to our planned procedures. So if we have 10 steps, how many of those steps did we follow like we said we were going to do? You can also think about it as measuring the extent to which conditions were different. That's important, right? So if something was happening in intervention that was part of your intervention, but it was also happening in baseline, then it's not an active ingredient in your intervention. You can also think about it as measuring the intervention that's actually received by the participant. So you could have a planned intervention, but if it only gets conducted 50% of the time, then the outcomes for the child would expect it to be different than if you had conducted it 100% of the time. So when we think about fidelity, I think it's important to think about 2 variable types. The first is an independent variable, and this is what we typically think of as the components of the intervention. So you're measuring behaviors that you expect to be different across baseline and intervention conditions, or the 2 intervention conditions if it's a comparison study. But control variables are also critical. So these are the things that should stay the same across conditions. So things like opportunities to respond. You might want to hold constant across intervention or across conditions. So generally we want to use direct systematic observation and recording for procedural fidelity data collection. And what that means is that we don't just complete a checklist once the session's finished that says, hey, I did all these things. We want to watch the session being conducted and have someone who's not the implementer record the extent to which the implementer did what they were supposed to do. So this is an actual example of procedural fidelity form, or part of one. I'm pretty sure this actually came from Paige Bennett's study that she's currently running. So part of the study we're using a constant time delay procedure. So what you'll see here is that for every single trial, we are assessing whether the implementer got the student's attention, gave the correct task direction and presented the stimulus, provided the appropriate weight interval, gave the appropriate prompt, gave the right consequence, and then recorded the student's data. So for every single trial that's conducted, we record whether those happened or not. And that's important because if we just recorded at the end of the session, did she get the student's attention, we might over or estimate the extent to which that actually happened, right? So if she only got the student's attention 8 out of 10 trials, then here we'd be able to say, okay, she did it 80% of the time. But if we just had a question at the end of the session, did she get the student's attention? If we say no, then we underestimate the extent to which she actually did it. But if we say yes, we overestimate the extent to which she actually did it. So it's important for behaviors that happen more than once to be recorded more than once. So every time a behavior happens or should happens, we need a place to say, okay, this happened as expected or didn't happen as expected. And there are different ways to measure fidelity. So almost always we see a percentage correct reported, and that's great. It allows us to determine the percentage of steps that someone did out of the percentage of steps they were supposed to. And this makes sense in a lot of cases. So for example, in a CTD session, it makes a lot of sense to report that the implementer conducted 95% of steps correctly and that most of the errors were in reinforcement provision. That provides us with lots of information about how well the study was conducted. Sometimes a percentage doesn't make a lot of sense. So in a different study that we're doing, we're using sort of a play-based procedure to increase imitation for young children with autism. And one of the things that we're doing during intervention that we're not doing during baseline is that we're imitating the play that the child's engaged in. But we don't really have a percentage of opportunities there, right? So at any given moment in time, we could be imitating what a kid is doing. And we don't want to imitate all the time, but we do want to imitate more than we did in baseline. So what we're doing is we're reporting the number of occurrences of imitation that happen in baseline, which are really low, and the number of occurrences that happen in intervention sessions, which is higher. So there isn't sort of a specific criteria that it makes sense for us to report a percentage correct on. So we're just reporting the differences between conditions, and that allows our consumers to see the extent to which the intervention condition was different than the baseline condition. You can also, when you have things like this imitation, you can set up a range. So you can say, this is the range of behaviors that we expect to see from the implementer. We expect the implementer to provide children with a choice of new activity 2 to 3 times per session, 2 to 4 times per session. So this sort of allows for some variability in implementer behavior while still maintaining sessions that are pretty similar across time. So here are some examples of each of these things, most of which I just talked about. So it's important thinking about fidelity to think about 2 levels when you're teaching adults and also measuring child behavior. One is implementation fidelity, which is, did we as researchers train the implementers as intended? So this could be just sort of an initial training, right? Did we conduct the training using the steps we said we would? But it could also include ongoing coaching. So we could measure implementation fidelity sort of at a single point in time, or we can measure it in the context of single case design, right? So we could repeatedly measure whether we're providing ongoing coaching and training like we said we would. The second level is procedural fidelity of the implementers. So did the actual implementers of the intervention implement the conditions as intended? Sometimes these are, I just lost my train of thought. Sometimes procedural fidelity of the adult is actually the dependent variable you're interested in, right? It's your proximal primary variable. And sometimes it's not. Sometimes you're interested in the child behavior, for example. So you would report implementation fidelity, which is how well did you train the teacher, for example. You'd report procedural fidelity, which is how well did the teacher implement the intervention, and then you'd have your dependent variable, which is child data. And it's important to note that when we include peers in intervention, so we do peer-mediated kinds of instruction, you should also report the fidelity of peers at doing what we've asked them to do. So typically we report fidelity data in tables, in narrative, or we can do it graphically. I really like to report fidelity data in tables. It provides, in a small space, a large amount of information. It allows you to report, for example, fidelity by behavior. So if you have 5 or 6 different behaviors, it might be important to note if your fidelity for one of those behaviors was much lower than for other behaviors. So if you say my fidelity was 90% overall, what I'm really interested in is, okay, which of those 10 behaviors did you consistently not engage in? And that's really helpful information, especially if the implementer is an endogenous implementer, like a teacher or a parent, because it tells you a lot about the steps that may be really difficult for teachers or parents to implement well, and that tells you a lot about the intervention, right? So if you have 90% fidelity, we'd say like, okay, great, 90% fidelity is fine. But if it's mostly one step that is consistently inaccurately conducted, we might ask ourselves, okay, did behavior change happen even though teachers or parents didn't do that step? And if the answer is yes, then maybe our conclusion is we don't need that step in our intervention because it's hard for parents and teachers, and we didn't need it to see behavior change for kids. So tabular information is sort of an easy way to digest more like granular versions of fidelity data. You can also report it in the narrative, especially if your fidelity was high overall, right? So if you have 99% fidelity, you don't really have to give me a table about it because probably almost everything was perfect. Also, if you measure fidelity during every session, so like in the case where you train a teacher and you measure the teacher behavior as well as the child behavior every session, you should probably present it graphically because it will be easier for the reader to draw conclusions about the relation between the adult behavior and the child behavior, or the implementer's behavior and the respondent's behavior. So a few sort of tips about measuring fidelity. If you can, you should measure fidelity in such a way that the implementers don't know when it's going to happen. So this is easiest when you have video. You just have someone who's not the implementer determine the fidelity schedule, and you don't tell the implementer when the fidelity checks will happen. If you can't do video, you can also have sort of unannounced fidelity checks, right? So just because the two people have to be there at the same time for fidelity to be measured doesn't mean that the implementer has to know ahead of time. So just sort of keeping it unannounced for the implementer is probably reduces some bias on the part of the implementer. Also, you really need to measure the most meaningful behaviors when you think about measuring fidelity. So I showed you Paige's sort of list of behaviors that needed to be conducted for CTD. We could probably add lots more behaviors, right? So most interventions include tons of different behaviors, but we really don't need to know, well, I'll say this. The more information we have is better, but also if you include 10 steps that are fairly unimportant for your intervention and 10 steps that are critical to your intervention, and you average all those together, it's not super helpful, because what we really need to know is to what extent did the implementers implement the steps that were most important for the intervention. So you should really consider what are the behaviors that matter the most, and those are the ones that you need to measure for fidelity. So how do you pick those? One thing that I sort of keep coming back to is you need to have a logic model. What about your intervention is going to result in behavior change? That's what you need to measure. You also need to measure things that are really important to keep the same, right? So if I want to see, for example, how well some antecedent intervention works for preventing problem behavior, then I will want the antecedent intervention to be the only thing that's different between baseline and intervention conditions. And a million things could be different, but you need to pick what are the things that definitely have to stay the same across conditions. So in that case, I would say the consequences provided for challenging behavior need to stay the same. If what you're interested in are the effects of the antecedent-based intervention, then you can't change the consequences as well. You need to make sure those remain the same. If you're going to do a peer-mediated intervention, you probably want to hold constant the kinds of adult support that the kid's receiving, unless that's part of your peer-mediated intervention. So you need to think about what are the behaviors that I really need to do for my intervention to work? What are the ones that I really need to keep the same across conditions to make this a fair and clean comparison? And then, okay, of all of these important things, what is feasible to measure? All right, that is all I have about fidelity. We'll do some more talking about it during class tomorrow. So as usual, you can submit questions via Google form using the QR code that's right here.